So anyway, the way King is often characterized, again, as the early king, the safer king. A very narrow number of quotes are used to remind us of his legacy, and therefore it is, usable, able to be manipulated, able to be deployed by a whole range of forces, which I think really, again, take us in a very different direction. I want to go back to this notion of the wide civil rights movement, because I want to talk about and remind you of the names of activists who really fought to expand the notion of what the civil rights movement was, what the Black freedom movement was. And there is just a great, smart, committed generation of historians who have brought these stories to life critically, analytically, not just in a celebratory way or not just writing hagiography, but really respecting the complexity of the work that many of these people did. I'm thinking now of Rhonda Williams' work on the housing struggle in Baltimore, in which she talked about women like Goldie Baker, who was just tireless and fearless and determined to fight around segregated housing in Baltimore for many, many years, and with a number of setbacks, personal and otherwise, but she persevered. And again, activists who weren't working for well-endowed nonprofits or foundations or university programs, but people who were volunteers, who volunteered their time after they took care of their kids and made their dinner and did whatever they had to do to earn a living, found time to go to meetings to try to make a difference with their friends and neighbors and community. So Goldie Baker is one of those people who I think we ought to remember and hold up as we kind of look back and assess how far we've come. Johnny Tillman, I mentioned before. Another person is Ruby Duncan, who was actually active in the welfare rights movement as well. When we talk about these people, the welfare rights movement in Las Vegas actually is well documented by historian Annalise Orlick, and she tells these great stories that I think have kind of fallen out of the collective memory of people who talk about that time, write about that time, but women, mothers who were low-income moms, took their children and marched down the Strip in Las Vegas and basically shut the Strip down. I mean, just had that kind of boldness in their activism, not ashamed of being poor, not thinking they didn't have rights because they didn't have jobs, but really demanding that the society take their humanity seriously. And by the way, all poor people work. If you're poor and don't do some kind of work, you don't last too long. So there is work. Some of it's paid work, and some of it isn't. But when we look at the victory of the 2008 election, when we look at the Obama administration 2 years in, when we look to the future and what kind of political movements might emerge out of this generation of activists, we really have to take stock of the children of Johnny Tillman, the grandchildren of Goldie Baker. Where are these young people? They're not in the White House. They mostly don't make it to Harvard. Most of them don't make it out of high school. They end up in these growing warehouses that we call prisons, which Michelle Alexander has written so eloquently and provocatively about. They end up on battlefields in Afghanistan because they can't afford college. They end up in homeless shelters when their families are foreclosed. And so it's those kinds of measures of progress and success, racial and economic, bound up together as they always have been, that we have to look to when we take out our scorecard and think of what has this past 3 or 4 years, including the campaign, represented in this political season. While the election of the nation's first black president, in fact, the first black man to be elected as head of state of a predominantly white country ever, is a blow to white supremacy. It's not a fatal blow. And those of us who look at women's history and certainly world history, there have been women heads of state without the abolition of sexism and patriarchy, right? And so here we are in this situation. But I think one of the challenges in assessing the current political moment, is really which direction do we look? In assessing a victory, and there are a number of reporters that are doing around Chicago, because of course the president comes from Chicago, asking activists questions about the upcoming midterm elections, and what's your assessment, and have things been a success or a failure? Is it, mostly good or mostly bad? And I keep coming back to the question, what is the criteria? What is the measuring stick? And I think it really is it's very top-down, it's a very patriarchal notion of leadership that we are constantly looking up to the president, to a minister, to someone in a kind of hierarchical structure as a measure of what's going to come next and who's going to get us out of the mess that we're in. But I think the most interesting thing and the most hopeful thing around the campaign of 2008 was actually not really the outcome, but the process. Because it really was an amazing process of mobilization that, was really reminiscent of some of the days of SNCC organizing and Black Panther Party organizing and grassroots efforts, welfare rights organizing, grassroots efforts of people to see political activism as not just voting, but really talking to friends and neighbors about ideas. Because ultimately, people were being asked to vote for a candidate, but the nature of this mobilization was one in which longtime activists and some new activists really went out and learned about issues and talked about issues and debated issues in all kinds of forums. And that, to me, was exciting, represented enormous potential, and I'm sad to say 2 years later, a lot of that potential was not realized. But I want to share with you a quote from someone who says this much more eloquently than I can, and someone who actually, unfortunately, was one of the first casualties in terms of the character assassinations that occurred after Barack Obama's victory, sort of teasing out people who had any kind of progressive activist history and targeting them, and this was the case with Van Jones, which Professor Cleaver knows very well and others do. But Van Jones, I thought, had a very insightful observation about how to assess the outcome of the election. Van Jones was a law school graduate, the founder of the Ella Baker Center in Oakland, the founder of the Green Jobs movement, and had a position in the administration and was criticized, attacked, vilified in the media, and eventually stepped down. He's still around, still doing good work. But the quote is this. He says, and I should say he's a Californian, so that might explain the metaphor he uses. Sometimes a surfer is so brilliant, skilled, and mesmerizing that one fails to see the giant current that propels him. And yet, as thrilling as the best surfers are, they ride massive, thundering waves that are even more awe-inspiring. In Barack Obama's case, he concludes, the beautiful wave is us. So challenging the notion of adoring crowds is just that. Van Jones' analysis suggests that similar to the 1950s and 60s and 70s, that the media fascination with a single charismatic leader obscures more than it reveals and obscures the critical variable that makes that leadership possible.